It's a great pleasure to be here with you to discuss about Brazilian modernism and Jorge Zaujupin work. And I start with this image of Zaujupin in his own house to introduce our conversation and to show you where is São Paulo, right? In South America, Brazil. This is a city, a very big city. 15 million people living there today. One of the biggest cities in the world. And it's in Brazil, the biggest city, the industrial center of the country, and a place where we had this big sprawl during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, considering the arrival from the end of the 19th century of many immigrants. So our issue today is also about immigration, and immigration of many architects and designers and artists, some of them coming from Poland. I am an example of it, not by an artist, but I'm from a Polish family. My grandfather was born close to Warszawa in Rawa Mazowiecka, 1 hour from here, so I'm very happy to be here. When Jorge Zaujupin was escaping from the Nazi persecution during the 40s, so during the Second World War, and after that, he was Jewish, as you know, and in a certain moment, being architect, working in France, he could see some images of Brazil and Brazilian landscape and Brazilian architecture like this. This is the Copacabana beach in Rio de Janeiro, for example. And for him, the mixture of these images of the city and the landscape, the tropical nature, and the modernist architecture in Brazil was a kind of invitation for him to imagine what could be a future in such a far world, but very amazing and promised land in this sense, because Brazil was in a process of urbanization and construction. For architects was a good place because of many works. And this is the cover of the catalog of an important exhibition about Brazilian architecture in New York, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, organized in 1943. And this is a Oscar Niemeyer work in Pampulha, Minas Gerais. Here we see many covers of magazines around the world showing Brazilian architecture. So it happened after this great exhibition in New York. And during the 40s and in the 50s, Brazil in architecture was in the top of the world because we had a different modernism. So if the European modernists based in Bauhaus style, for example, and some of the examples you probably had here in Poland during the communist times, blocks, very rigid blocks, rationalist for extreme. In Brazil, we had a different modernism because it was a kind of mixture of the plasticity of Le Corbusier architecture combined with our Baroque tradition and some freedom coming from the landscape and the nature and our openness and the openness of our culture, you know, the carnival and some street parties and the culture of the body and many of these things. Also, the chapel of Pampulha by Niemeyer in the 40s is a completely new example in terms of modernist architecture. Some say that this was a great influence for Le Corbusier, for example, in Honsham, because the Honsham Chapel by Le Corbusier is after this Nehemiah's Chapel. And here we see these parabolic vaults, the experimentalism of doing a wall that is at the same time the ceiling. So these organic forms, like a gigantic snake covering the terrain. This is a complex housing building in Rio. This is the Carioca School. Carioca means coming from Rio de Janeiro. And Oscar Niemeyer, Lúcio Costa, Afonso Eduardo Reide, some of these important Brazilian architects that moment that created what somebody called Brazilian style in terms of modernist architecture. And of course, when Jorge Zalzupin arrives and starts to work as a designer, for example, Lisa was talking about this today. This Danish armchair, for example, this is the name of the piece. It's a kind of tricky because you can think, this is a Danish influence. Not so much. It is more a personal interpretation of Oscar Niemeyer's architecture in Brasilia. So this lightness of the structure, this is very important for us. And Niemeyer created exactly this approach to structure in terms of form. So the volumes becoming very thin when touching the ground. And Zalzupin did almost the same thing in terms of furniture, and this is so beautiful. In this coffee table also, it's quite the same thing. As you see, the connection with this Alvorada Palace columns, for example. So it's not imitation, it's a dialogue. So it's a creation altogether in this mood of Brazilian lightness. So we see it very clearly in Zalzupin's work as a designer. In his architecture is different. We will see later in this conference. Now I go back to 1922. So this is the birth of the Brazilian modernism. This is the start, this is the ground zero, because that moment in São Paulo in 1922, some artists coming from literature and visual arts and music also decided to organize a week of modern art. So it was a moment of fight. So it was a struggle against the conservative environment. And in municipal theater, they create these events. But that time, there were only two architects participating in this movement. One was Polish, Georg Przyszrembel, something like that, sorry. What is funny is that one was Polish, another one was Spanish, but both were neo-colonial. What that means? It was a style of architecture that tried to copy Portuguese architecture from the colonial times. So it was a Polish copying Portuguese architecture and trying to do what would be Brazilian architecture, because you have to understand that we Brazilians, we had slavery, labor until almost the end of the 19th century. We were colony almost at the same time. So we enter in the 20th century trying to be modern, but at the same time trying to understand who we are in terms of country, in terms of people, and in terms of culture. That's why the modernist movement was a bit connected to this neo-colonial movement, because it was a search for identity. And in 1922, we didn't have modernist architects. We do had modernist poets, we do had modernist painters, like Tarsila do Amaral, for example, very famous. but we didn't have modernist architects. So we had to wait a bit to the arrival of Gregory Warshawskyk coming from Russia. He was Ukrainian. He was born in Odessa, Russian-Ukrainian, immigrating to São Paulo in 1923 and building the first modernist house in Brazil in 1928. For the critics and the people living in Brazil that time, this house was a kind of UFO, a kind of something very strange arriving from the sky, I don't know, from somewhere. And he did some modernist houses that time. It was a scandal. And okay, so it was very important. He is the pioneer. He was introducing modernism in architecture in Brazil, but in some sense, architects from Rio, because this was in São Paulo, and Rio was the capital. So architects in Rio, like Lúcio Costa, said, okay, Warshawskyk is important. His modernist houses were very important to us, but it's not Brazilian modernist architecture. It is modernist architecture, European modernist architecture in Brazil. So the challenge for us is to create a Brazilian modernist architecture, how to incorporate this proposition and mix to our own tradition. In São Paulo, we had many other important immigrants, because São Paulo is the city of the immigration. As I told you, the attraction of the money for the industry. So the money was there in São Paulo. So and São Paulo, because São Paulo is a very new city in terms of the history of the country, because it was a very small village until the 19th century. So it was a boom in the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, attracting immigrations. So Rino Levi is Italian, born in São Paulo from an Italian family, but went to live in Italy. He studied architecture in Rome, and after that he comes back to São Paulo and worked there, building many modernist houses, elegant, so nice and important in this context. And this is the key figure for us, Le Corbusier, because he's the great influence coming from France. He was Swiss-French, but this purism in terms of architecture. And Le Corbusier went to South America in 1929 to conferences. He did it in São Paulo and in Rio, but the most important visit is in 1936 because of the process of designing the new building for the Ministry of Education and Health in Rio. So that moment, the government of Getúlio Vargas, the ministry was an important man of culture, and there were a competition for the project of the building, and won an architect that belonged to the new colonial movement. And the ministry said, no, we want to be a modernist state of development in terms of industry and culture. We cannot build a new colonial building for the state. We have to do a modernist building. And they canceled the competition and invited Lúcio Costa, who was a young modernist architect in Rio, to design it. But Lúcio Costa was very modest and young, and he never built anything. So he said, no, you should invite Le Corbusier in person. He has to come. And they bring. So this is the arrival, Le Corbusier arriving, yes, in Rio, like God, being received as a God. And everybody goes there and says, oh, yes, please, tell us how to do it. You are the master. And Le Corbusier spent 3 weeks in Rio designing the project with the young Brazilian architects as students working with him. And the result is this building, the first skyscraper modernists in the world. You see, it was 1936, because that time, as you know, Europe was during the wars, United States was after the crash of 29. So in South America, it was a kind of freedom and a state authoritarian government putting money to do it. So this is a skyscraper with the 5 points for modernist architecture created by Corbusier. So the garden roof, the pilotis, the free facade, the glass facade, the brise-soleil, protection against the sunlight, and very important, ceramic tiles painted by Portinari, our great painter. So this is the birth of this Brazilian style, incorporating tropical gardens by Burle Marx at the same time. After this super important project of the ministry building, Oscar Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa, both together with Corbusier in this project, but now without Corbusier, only the two, designed the Brazilian Pavilion for the World Fair in New York in 1939. And this was a great success. Everybody in 1939 in New York during this World Fair looked at Brazilian Pavilion and the finished pavilion by Alvar Aalto and says, we have now Siegfried Gideon, the director of the Congress of International Modern Architecture, wrote an important article saying, it's good for us that now we have new traditions in modernism, one in South America, Brazil, and another one almost in the North Pole, in Finland. So, and bringing different elements to the modernism, that means curves, freedom, more liberty of creating surfaces. And this is the Brazilian Pavilion in 1939. We see this completely freedom in terms of form and in a rigid structure, right? It's a module of structure, but the form goes out and in. So, and Niemeyer did the same many times. It's a kind of the same idea with variations. This is his own house in Rio, the curve of slabs dialoguing with the movements of the mountains, for example. Very thin and delicate. This is a gigantic wave of concrete in the city center of São Paulo, designed by Niemeyer at the same time. It's the symbol of the city. And the Ibirapuera Park, it's a cultural complex for leisure and culture, where is the biennial pavilion, for example, and this great marquees connecting all the buildings in a park, designed by this very important architect coming from Rio, but Brazilian architecture. That time, in the early 50s, when the first biennial of arts was done, in terms of art, it was a shift from our modernist art, that means the search for national identity, Tarsila that I showed to you, it was a painting of the Rio of Favela. It was, that time, it was painting including naturalism in some sense, right? Figures, all of that. But it was now, that time in the early 50s, breaking this tradition and proposing abstract art. So incorporating the influence of Mondrian or Malevich, so this avant-gardes, completely abstract, and based on the influence also of the importance of our architecture, because the Brazilian architecture was truly modern in this sense. Here we see works from this period, for example. And this is a shift, because this is in São Paulo. So São Paulo, that time, creating the biennial and incorporating this abstract art that we call in Portuguese concretista, that means concrete art, in terms of geometry, rationality, universalism, so giving the backs to the idea of national identity. We don't need nationality anymore. We are in the world. At the same time, the immigrants coming. I'm introducing the context for you to understand the arrival of Zhao Xuping and some others. Vila Nova Artigas house, the facade is an abstract painting, for example, incorporating this art in architecture. So, this is for you to understand a bit what happened to São Paulo. These are two pictures of the same place from different points of view, which is Anhangabaú Valley. This is in the city center with a gap of 100 years. So in the first photo, in the end of the 19th century, the whole population of São Paulo was 240,000 people. 100 years after, in the end of the 20th century, it was 11 million. So you see what happened. Almost impossible to control this city, right? What happens is completely out of control. And the architects were there trying to design it, but very difficult. Lucian Korngold, a Polish architect, very important, that immigrates in the beginning of the Second World War, Jewish also, being well received in São Paulo and building a kind of classical modernism. As you see here, we see another picture of very important building, office building in the city center. You see the symmetry, the modulation. So he brought this experience of European modernism to the concrete industry in São Paulo, developed industry of concrete and the real estate market, and he could be well established as an architect there. As the same of Franz Repp, German architect that went from Germany to France, worked with Le Corbusier in his own studio, and after that, in 47, just after the war, going to São Paulo and being also well received and building many important buildings. In the same sense, what I say is a kind of classical modernism in terms of symmetry, elegance. Franz Repp incorporating colors, as you see here. It's a housing building. Very nice. And Lina Bobardi, for sure. Lina, the same year of 47, just after the war, going from Italy to first to Rio and then to São Paulo, is a couple, Lina and Pietro Maria Bardi. He was invited to be the director of the Museum of Art of São Paulo, a very important job. So they were established in São Paulo, building their own house known as Glass House in the Morumbi neighborhood. That was that time in the early 50s, in a place completely empty of São Paulo, as you can see. It's astonishing, right? It was only nature and this modernist house in the middle of nothing. It's beautiful. What we see is a super modernist, elegant in terms of architecture and these glass facades. But Lina, the work of Lina changed a lot after that, after the experience in Bahia, in the northeast of the country, in the 60s, and coming back to São Paulo, she designed the new building for the Museum of Art of São Paulo, which is also a symbol of the city in terms of architecture. And part of the museum is, I could say, downstairs, and another one is elevated, and in the middle we have this free space, which is a public space, maybe the more vibrant public space of the city. So riot, demonstrations, spectacles of music and other things happens there. And I curated an important exhibition about Brazilian architecture in House of the Architecture in Portugal some years ago, and the title we decided to name the exhibition was Infinite Span. It's because we have this in Brazilian modern architecture, this desire of creating span. So to float, to put the building in the air, floating, almost without columns, the sense of lightness, and but with huge structure, right, of concrete. Now we go back to Zhao Shuping to better understand his work and what happened in that. So he arrived in 1949, first to Rio and then to São Paulo, as you see, at the same time of many others, and being well received. He first worked as architect with Korngold. Korngold was also Polish, so it was important for him. Korngold had a great company of projects in architecture. This is a building, a skyscraper, a glass skin skyscraper in the city center. They did it together, Zhao Shuping and Korngold. Now again we see maybe a kind of influence of North American architecture in terms of this image of the skyscraper, of the capitalism, and the office towers. Very well designed and super elegant. But at the same time, what he himself, Zhao Shuping, designs for himself, for his family, is totally different. So this is the Zhao Shuping's house in São Paulo. And when we see it, so it's completely different from everything we see in terms of architecture in São Paulo. It's different from this international design with Korngold, with the skyscraper, for example, but it's also completely different from the brutalist architecture of São Paulo of that period. I will show you. But this is, you see a curved wooden roof, for example, in the mezzanine connecting to the living room, where there is a rough stone wall and ceramic tiles on the floor. I see some influence of maybe now, yes, Scandinavian, not exactly Danish as the armchair, but maybe Finnish, Alvar Aalto, and empiricism, another tradition different from Corbusier. I know Zhao Shuping liked Corbusier a lot, but when designing, maybe he chose another tradition, not so much Polish, I think, but dealing with materials much more than the tradition in São Paulo that time. This is the brutalist architecture of São Paulo. This is the symbol of the architecture in São Paulo in the 60s and in the 70s. Vila Nova Artigas Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism, where I teach. This is a concrete building where you see this big ceiling with the sunlight coming, the structure very clearly, the space, the transparency in terms of comprehension of the whole space, and the structure being the element of importance. But we see the same thing in houses, for example, like this house designed by Artigas with a ramp, incorporating ramps in private houses, for example, is something new that time. And Paulo Mendes da Rocha own house in São Paulo, it's quite the same thing. But the thing is, you can ask me why. Of course, for a faculty, I can understand this language, but for houses, the fact is, we were in the 60s during a military dictatorship. These architects in general were communists. They were out of possibilities of working for big another things different from houses. So Artigas said, but we are, as architects, we have the compromise of building the future of the country as an ideology of what we call developmentalism. So architects are involved in the sense of building the country with the industry of concrete and growing cities. So Artigas said, we have to test in private houses what we really should do for bus terminals, for schools, for public works. That's why we see some houses that looks like infrastructure, no? But for sure, Zhao Shuping, there's nothing, no connections with this ideal of developmentalism of the country, nothing like that. He was doing his own work for himself and for some people who was searching for another way of living. So when we see Zhao Shuping houses from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, what we can see here in this exhibition, as you probably saw it, is a completely different architecture and different from Paulista tradition, from Brazilian tradition also. That's why it's so nice to understand it and to try to understand this singular production. A kind of labyrinth, right? It's the opposite of this transparency and the structure building everything. No, here we don't see exactly where is the structure. We see like being in a cocoon or a shell, very protected from the outside. So this sense of being protected, like Marina said and Veronica the other day, like being in the mother's belly. So the house for him, it was... This is a memory connected to Poland in this sense. So this is a memory connected to a trauma of being out of his country, out of the sense of protection, maybe in houses, in architecture, very different from furniture. In architecture, the creation of a space, of an environment, so the desire to be protected. So if we see in Brazilian architecture many glass facades, connection to the outside, for Zhao Shuping is the opposite. So rough walls and protection. So labyrinth, a bit of chaotic spaces, creation of this design together with the workers, because it's almost impossible to design it. Okay, we see this drawing, but in reality is another thing. So you have to be there and to decide it in the site together with the workers. And here we see, for example, this Mediterranean architecture, right? Very white, with these sculptural forms. I see some Antoni Gaudí influence in terms of imaginary, so mood, very different from Brazilian perspective in this sense, and very experimental also. That's why we can maybe we can see, is it an incorporation of postmodernism? Maybe it is. I don't know. We had to ask it to Jorge. We cannot do it anymore. But we see this working with the space in verticality, with the roofs, with dynamic roofs, creating movements, and the white walls and the concrete ceiling. Like this, for example, is super dramatic. You know? And I don't have the image, but here we can see maybe a dialogue with Ronchamp Chapel by Le Corbusier. The weightness of the construction and the small size of the human figure in this almost a sacred space. And this is the Guarujá house of Marina and Patrick. He built for himself, for the family. And again, we see this Mediterranean, and there's no symmetry. It's quite the opposite. So giving their backs to the classical tradition. So it's another stuff. That's what you said, like being the uterus. So in a very organic and protected world. This is Zhao Xuping's world in terms of architecture, very different from his design of furniture and different from the Brazilian tradition in architecture that time. Incorporating also the plastics and the resins, the mood of the 70s, the pop culture, as almost being a cell of astronauts in the sky. This is L'Atelier. This would be the start of a new lecture about design. It's not the purpose today. Thank you very much. Thank you. So now we have time for discussing, if you want. If somebody has some questions, we can continue.
I have been in Brazil 25 years ago, so I know Papulia and my first Rio. But I must say I'm very impressed, and I came across a name of Zanjui, but I'm very disappointed that during our studies we know nothing about it. I know that one of the curators, and I've been singing here about Tome Grigari. I studied with him on 1 year, because he started as an architect and then went to design. So I must say I'm very happy that this exhibition came to life here in Poland. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Bravo. Yeah?
So, could you recommend any book about Brazilian modernism? Because there were so many interesting materials, and I'm very curious if you can recommend us anything to read, to spend more time looking at the pictures and get some more information. Thank you.
Yes, sure. So, for example, I wrote a chapter in a book that maybe you can find here, published by Phaidon Press, called Brazil's Modern Architecture. So this is a great book about many aspects of Brazilian modernist architecture, and I have a chapter there by Phaidon. Another one would be the catalog of the exhibition I told you, Infinite Span. It was published by Casa da Arquitetura in Portugal in an English version, together with an international publishing house. I don't remember now, but maybe not so hard to find. The exhibition 2018 in Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you, Gili. I think, Matilda, maybe the foundation, Visteria Foundation, is has very close contact to us in Brazil. So they will be able to make the bridge. If you ask them, contact them for more information, they can do it. Thank you so much. Welcome.
And also, there is this Spanish magazine of architecture called 2G. I don't know if you know, 2G, a number and a letter, character. 2G in Barcelona, and is a magazine of monographs of architects. And I edited the issue about Paulo Mendes da Rocha and about Vila Nova Artigas as well. So two important Paulista architects, brutalists, there. You can find it because there is the printed version, but also a PDF in the website.
Questions?
Thank you.